Hello everyone, today we talk about Rome in the last years of Augustus' life, introducing different topics at a time. We made already numerous videos about the Augustan era. It's all really and only the beginning. This is valid for any other topic that we cover on a regular basis. It is true that, of course, there are other imperial dynasties, for example, such as the Flavians, about whom I not made even a single video. This depends actually on the random cyclicity of and diversity of the topics that I pick. So they will arrive statistically sooner or later, even maybe with some repetition, because of course the material is the same, but as large as it can be, but the odds obviously aren't. In any case, the period here is particularly crucial. Today's video is dedicated mostly to this sort of, again, panorama, and it belongs really to the playlist that I created, even with a touristic intent, right? For discovering Rome and her unmatchable legacy. And that can help appreciate some secondary aspects, and or at least some that one may not think of altogether from some perspectives. And it really gets down to a talk, to a story, to a tale, right? So I think starting from Augustus' succession is important. In his constitutional position, he would naturally exclude dynastic succession, right? Because the Romans were not ready for that. It's obvious that the gens Iulia had monopolized control in a monarchic fashion, but the res publica was politically and socially organized in a way in which the traditional oligarchy was still in charge, and with whom, in fact, Augustus had shared de facto the control of the empire on very stable basis, of course, for the times and places, but still in that particularly equilibrated way that only Augustus' persona could really make work, and we will talk about this better, right, especially from an institutional profile, many other videos, right? There was also another element that would prevent Augustus from choosing a dynastic successor per se, for that is the simple reason that he had no sons, right? He had only one daughter, Julia, from his second wife, Scribonia. So there had to be a compromise, fundamentally, as a solution, which constituted in the conferment on the designated heir that was actually a different person at different times, as we will see, and as you, I think, probably already know, those roles that characterized the Augustan individual power, that are notoriously the greater proconsular power and the tribunician one, right? So essentially a greater control on the Roman military and the capacity of vetoing the senatorial deliberations. In other words, he would maintain an hegemony on the system that derived, in fact, as the term goes, from augere. It's the same etymology in Indo-European of sebastos, right, that was also used by Hellenistic rulers to specify this capacity of literally augmenting his own power in virtue, of course, of his role of divine medium, right, and as especially adoptive son of Caesar, that, as we've seen, had metaphysically in his religion of the Fortuna Caesaris, literally come out of the res publica during the terrible civil wars that could occur only because the God-chosen people of Rome had basically sinned, that is, infringing the secrecy of the Sibylline books, and therefore making the world risk not to be saved, right, by mankind. And so he succeeded through his imperium, right, to put the world together, essentially self-sacrificing himself in the process. That's also why he was deified, recognized as such. There's a lot to that, right, even among his political adversaries when he was alive regarding his quasi-divinity. And Caesar, as you know, in a sort of relatively unexpected way, had recognized in Octavian this great mind that had to essentially inherit what Caesar had now fixed for Octavian, later Augustus, to carry the res publica essentially to safer havens, and finally putting an end to the last civil wars. And Augustus' character, policy, and just nature, right, was about such balance, right? A balance that we have already discussed as far as properly the balance of the orders of the Roman ruling establishment was concerned, after having settled, in fact, the main crisis, not just of the war, but also the thorny question of the enormous amount of veterans that were provided with land, also together, as you know, with the military reforms. We really saw this from a financial point of view. I've seen the Lex Julia. We make lots of videos about the Augustan era, the establishment of the urban cohorts, and more. So a huge apparatus that, of course, Rome had never witnessed before, and especially concentrated in the hands of a single man. To this degree of absolute terms, naturally there was a past of Roman monarchy, traditionally, and of course Augustus, as we will see now, would walk in the footsteps of his Romulian, in fact, predecessors. And again, a topic like this would require tens of videos on their own, so I'm not going to digress on it. But the dynastic succession had to occur, obviously, through a principle of spiritual fitness, still recognized, however, in the somatic capacity of this de facto monarchic entourage, right, that the Senate would recognize with their blessing. And more, because the res publica was actually sympathetic to the system that Augustus had quite carefully and balancedly laid out. So firstly, Augustus thought of finding a heir within the family by marrying his daughter, Julia, to her cousin, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, that was the son of the same Augustus' sister, Octavia, right? From the gens Octavia, which, after Marcellus' death in 23 BC, however, Augustus had to arrange his daughter's second marriage, this time with his most faithful friend and advisor, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, that we will discuss later, because really deserves, and as you know, he is, say, not underappreciated, because at least everybody knows what he carried out and pulled off for Augustus from a military point of view. But he was also an interesting figure, also in his political and sort of civilian background, right? And from the union between Julia and Agrippa, 5 children were born. 3 sons, Gaius, Lucius, and Agrippa Postumus, and 2 daughters, Julia and Agrippina. These were, of course, the Augustus favored successors in general, because essentially they were his grandchildren, and they represented through also his most loyal friend the continuity of an important political historical legacy, right? And were really bred into a dramatic sense of themselves, their imperial role, their genetic superiority, so that the responsibility, the burden, what was expected of them crushed, especially Gaius. That was I discussed this in those videos about the heroization in the electoral sees, etc., that were essentially supervised by these deified figures after their death. But also their history is actually quite and tragically fascinating. We'll look at them a bit better. In fact, this is what happened. Gaius and Lucius were adopted by Augustus as his own sons in 17 BC, so they would succeed him as such. And they were named for this reason, in fact, Gaius Caesar and Lucius Caesar. Agrippa, at this point, was practically Augustus' co-regent, right? However, he died in 12 BC. And the two sons of his in 2 and 4 AD, respectively. Gaius, out of a wound that he received in Armenia, but seemingly he didn't die of this injury, rather of the moral blow that he received, as effectively that was his first office, and he it ended in disaster. And basically he let himself go. There are very touching moments in which he was on the Black Sea, right, in recovering and literally writing to his grandfather, "Look, I can't make it. Right, what happened to me is too much." And just think, for someone like Augustus that had really been through what he had been through, what he had accomplished, and what he represented, to also humanly feel for this young man who was basically broken at that point and literally let himself die as a consequence, and also thinking that genetic continuity, like, this is a sort of curse for my own sins, right? It's something deeply ingrained in Roman and traditional mentality alike. Lucius instead died during military service, but essentially, as it was also tragically and riskily frequent at the time, as he broke his femur after having fallen from a horse, and the wound infected, and he passed away. So at this point, the third option was Agrippa Postumus, that, however, right, was unfit for rule. Augustus had actually him adopted, but also soon exiled to the island of Pandataria, that is modern Ventotene, due to his likely mental instability that had brought him to quite let's say low and immoral conduct. So apparently Augustus was horrified, but his grandchild is, and had him exiled. The same fate, by the way, was reserved for two important Iulii, that is, the same Augustus' daughter and granddaughter, the first of whom had married Tiberius Claudius Nero, so the future emperor, right? Augustus' stepson, as he was the son of Livia, Augustus' third and final, sort of more representative, definitely, wife, and her previous husband. This is interesting because the relation between Augustus and Tiberius, as you know, was somehow, unhappy. They were really two different people, and it would have been crushing for Tiberius to take on the same role of princeps after Augustus' death, because really what the latter had done was not even felt, even the Roman, even the oligarchic tradition, to be replicable, at least necessarily. But this guy had been basically brought away from his legitimate and biological father's house, together with his mother, in Augustus 1, right? And this is how they literally adopted children, which was really a quite common practice in Rome for the political, again, dynastic interests of these various houses. Again, it was a huge honor, right? But just think about it from a sentimental point of view. Plus, in the process of Tiberius' marriage with Julia, that had quite an ambition there, because she was basically the second woman of the empire after Livia, that was just her stepmother, as we've seen. So there were issues at the same time, and Julia didn't actually like Tiberius, who had, in order to marry her, had to divorce from his previous wife, which apparently broke his heart because he was very much in love with her. And so this new relationship would be particularly unhappy. Julia, as we'll see now, was also unfaithful to Tiberius, which was a huge deal because of Augustus' moral laws, and so this exposed also we'll see again now that the morality of the same stock that should have allegedly ruled the Golden Age, and this was incredibly difficult for Augustus, that came to exile, in fact, his own daughter, notoriously, to be coherent with his the moral standards that he had reaffirmed, and also in functional terms. So this was an important issue, in as much as Tiberius himself was not very sympathetic to Augustus, to say the least. Augustus, again, was a man of extreme balance, right? In, say, deeply ideal, but also, great political insight and intelligence at the same time. So, with a quite practical sense of what had to be done, even in a personal fashion, right? To embody that level of absolute order and balance, right? That, as we'll see now, he was inspiring himself from as the new Apollo, or at least this generational continuity should have, of course, brought to the fore, like for Gaius Caesar, that sense of the new stock of the Julii, right, on the fore. Tiberius was not a Julius, if not by adoption, and he was instead a very different man. He was a sensitive, passionate, but introverted, sensual man. He was actually, and to his credit in pop culture, this is never stressed enough, one of the best generals of the empire, right? If you look at his campaign in Germany, etc., you really have an interesting profile of a true Roman who knew what duty was in that sense, but that could not, right, by his nature, be the same as Augustus. Tiberius was, by character, even sort of follower in some ways, and just Augustus' presence was crushing in many ways. Right? Apparently, when he showed up, right, and in Augustus' presence, he looked somehow gloomy, and this would, take down the otherwise usually, positive Augustus there. So that there was a deep moral intertwinement between the two that, of course, rested on the enormous responsibility at that point of the inheritance of the world domination. Plus, Tiberius had left Rome exactly also because of Julia's betrayal, and he had self-exiled to Rhodes, right? One of, as you know, the greatest Hellenistic capitals. When he was recalled, in fact, to Rome and adopted by Augustus as his son. taking the name of Tiberius Julius Caesar as a consequence. In 4 AD, the tribunician power was conferred to him as Augustus' heir, and in 11 AD, he also obtained the greater proconsular power. Right? Thus, this allowed his succession later on, also thanks to the de facto fusion at this point between the Iuli and the Claudi, as the two gentes now would in fact be, and not just because of Tiberius, but also because of all how they essentially married into one another, would in fact bring us to define the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And there is an interesting background of Augustus' life that we will see surely better in depth in some other videos. There are some aspects of it that are notionistically fascinating. Right. First of all, near Velletri, in the south of Rome, there is the, in fact, suburban villa of the Octavi. Right, and this is actually a pretty large one. Right, and it is, at least it was identified with the one of Octavian's family. So these were areas historically populated by Italic peoples. The Volsci, Livia too, was originary of that area in the south of Rome. In any case, of course, this house belonged to one of the highest levels. Right, Octavian was actually born on the Palatine hill. Right. And of course, throughout his life, he would have, worthy residences, to say the least. But of course, we remember Roman modesty, as far as, especially even the most powerful clans were concerned, was showed off with, in fact, the preservation in this case, which was venerated in imperial times, in the aforementioned villa, of a very modest environment, let's say, for the status of this family. More similar to a pantry than a room, with some exaggerations. Of course, they had their own comforts, and we will see now, as far as Augustus' Palatine house that you can still visit in Rome. And there is one, at least legend says, that Augustus in part had been at least living in the villa of Velletri. He was not born there, actually, even if, of course, there are voices, right? The sources are sometimes contradictory, but we know, say, through, say, philology and that, we can trust that that news. In Rome, Octavian initially had lived near the Forum, above the Scalae Annulariae, that were called like this because they were home to the jewelers' shops, annulus meaning ring, by the way. Octavian had then bought the house of the famous orator Hortensius. I mean, he had already died. He was not really... Well, yes, he was his contemporary, but, this was in a later time. Of course, these buildings remained, and they had a name, and they belonged to those, to the heirs of these figures. And we are on the Palatine Hill, as a matter of fact. And unlike many aristocratic domus of the time, Octavian's residence did not stand out for particular luxury. Right at that point, Octavian was already in the political game, etc. So the sense was to show not just the modest character of the politician, in spite of the enormous wealth that he owned, and the fact that, of course, he had quite straightforward ambitions and just the status of Caesar's heir. But also for out of respect for the same Palatine, the fact that he had to rule right in Rome from this hill, next to of course, the more foundational one of the Capitolium, and of course their sort of metaphysical presence, and it had to be, in fact, the symbol of the entire Roman household, right? As such, had to reflect those kind of moral characteristics. Right. For example, valuable marbles and mosaics are absent. Right. This would have seen as too frivolous, to just an extra decoration. It's if you visit it, you realize immediately that it was not just like, I don't know, a poor place to live in, to say the least. There are decorations, there are frescoes that are still beautifully to be seen and admired. But overall, right, there were surely more sumptuous places also where Augustus lived at other times, like, whenever he traveled. But he behaved as a true Roman, like stressing the importance of his own home that had to be just functional to the minimum of what was effectively a Roman, like all others, just like the primus inter pares as a princeps, right? But then setting the example as a son of a god, as he styled himself, not just because he was Caesar's son in that regard, but as we've seen in our last video about Jovian theology, of course, referring to the divine origins of the gens Julia. Like, people think, well, yes, Caesar boasted, of course, also publicly, his descendants from Venus, from Mars. But if you go back through the Anchises and his ancestors, of course, they all, like everyone in as the absolute, but with that greater sort of say chain of ancestors, straight to Jupiter, to God himself, right? So this is the sense, of course. It's not the material wealth per se that also a true Roman patron has to constantly reinvest in order to make politics work, which is really sensible, so given that, of course, the economy of the time is very different from today, also in terms of surplus growth rate and so on. And Augustus had literally built the empire with that enormous wealth he had managed to win from his enemies. As a consequence, his habitation shows a small porch, a terrace where he could work peacefully, constituting its ornaments and advantages, let's say. Augustus slept for 40 years in the same room, right, whenever, of course, he was in Rome, and on the same simple bed, right? The Romans had a substantially different house space and function compared to our own, predictably. Of course, there was also a repartition of the roles in the house. When Augustus, for example, wanted to be at peace, he went to sleep over some freedmen or Mycenas, right? But because, of course, also this place had still a sort of residential role with some internal rules, etc. And of course, he was the master of the empire. He could choose anywhere to rest. The house of Augustus enlarged, by the way, several times by purchasing other adjacent houses, including one intended expressly for Livia's apartments, which, of course, tells you also the actual size of this modest, say, palace right on the Palatine hill, was in, and this is the most important aspect, in close relation with the temple of Apollo Palatine, right? We have explained countless times what kind of role Apollo had, again, in the Jovian theology, as the youth, as the symbol of the golden era of the eternal rejuvenation, and so what Augustus' rule had brought after the civil wars, and so also in the establishment of the Pax Romana, that same reason for which Romanity remained at the core of any empire later on, and was recognized always starting from Augustus, in spite of of course, the imperial essence being immanent in the ecclesiam universal, that is divine potential. In any case, the temple of Apollo Palatine was connected with Augustus' house via an internal passage, so that the princeps could have access had to the abode of the god who protected him. He had this giant statue. There are many statues actually still to be seen there that are actually from Augustus' times, but it was this giant statue of Apollo that had to represent, in fact, the golden era, and so also transmit to Augustus as a divine medium the right insight, let's say. Likewise, Livia's apartments were located near the temple of the Magna Mater, that, as you know, was a chthonic, Pelasgian, of course, top maternal deity that was necessary for the Apollonian virile Jovian principle to be tamed, possessed, and in this sense being transfigured from the demonic inferic, like telluric dimension, to the most earthly prosper one. And so Livia, of course, had to embody the female principle, had to be the Roman woman par excellence, and she had to be inspired by the Magna Mater, right? In this, of course, order and subjection to the virile authority. By all means, this represented, first of all, the cosmic order, right, in itself concluded in the Golden Era, and the exceptional nature of the characters who lived there in this house is underlined by such divine standards, and the message appears even more evident if we consider that tradition placed the house or hut of Romulus in the same area of Augustus' house, right? Only Augustus, in other words, refounder of Rome and of the universe, Romulus had transfigured in heaven after having accomplished Rome to the world, right? And her, of course, evangelical destiny of domination. And this house was protected equally by his ghost as much as the one of Apollo. And Augustus obviously was the only person that could live in that place in virtue, in fact, of his divine role, right? Consider, of course, that the Romans were even more sensitive and aware of the symbolism at the time, so we often have this, again, modernistic and secularistic and desecrated and even some satirical view of whoever holds power, especially in the past, etc. But, you know, the values that were expressed there were of the highest order, and they appeared as terrifying as Jovian in character. So if we pass to the world out there, right, from Augustus' house, and specifically within the boundaries of Italy that had been, again, now reorganized by Augustus, we can appreciate better what the imperial nature of the Romano-Italic confederacy that now had basically become all one, as we will see better also in Augustan reorganization, in Romanity, right, is incredibly eloquent as well. Augustus had, in fact, divided Italy into 11 regiones, regions, right? However, this was not an administrative division of the peninsula compared to, say, the modern country, right? Italy was at the time essentially becoming just the peninsular part plus what had formerly been Cisalpine Gaul, as the region had been intensely Romanized, and now it was to fully be transfigured in Romanity, also considering that it was essentially the most strategically important region in the empire, right? Because essentially the legionary manpower was based there, was gradually extending through the aforementioned Roman colonization and veteran settlement, also in other regions, especially Gaul, right? Transalpine Gaul. But at this point, still, Augustus, of course, had favored this area that had been the one for the control of which he had struggled during the civil wars. Think about the bloody Mutina, and that had allowed him, in fact, to even prevail over his rival Antony, that had, yes, the greater riches of the East, right, but not the manpower of the West, right? So when you look at the Italian subdivision, you can realize that it was a geographical framework for the centralized organization of demographic data resulting from the censuses, and probably also for other archival operations, such as land registers, lists of imperial properties, definition of fiscal districts, right? And needless to say, Italy had been the beating heart of the empire. Such it had been probably this land that had been ruling over other peoples, right? And now in Augustan times, this was ever more evident, given that the emperor had essentially expanded further, also in a more continental European dimension for good, and establishing significant boundaries that we'll see better at other points in another video. So the criterion for the formation of the new Italian regions responded to the desire to valorize the ancient populations that had now converged in the new Roman Italy, right, which essentially extended from the Alps to the Strait of Messina. And this is very important because Sicily and Sardinia remained provinces, right? Ancient Italy is just the continental part. And the regions are initially named with an order number, such as Regio Prima, Regio Secunda, etc. However, the use of names that recall the ancient inhabitants of the single region, that were now, however, all Roman citizens, right, because they had received that now to the fullest, soon became established. You had, famously enough, Latium et Campania, right? This was probably the beating heart of Italy. As such, instead, Rome maintained strong ties with the Campania Felix throughout all the antiquity, and even the early and even part of the High Middle Ages, right? It's just in later times that Rome became essentially more tied to the central northern dimension, right? And it's in medieval and modern times that it also acquired essentially a Tuscan dialect, right? The previous one was more similar to the Campanian one. Then you have Sabina and et Samnium, right? Apulia et Irpinia. They were paired like this, also to stress this were of course administrative needs, but there was a sense of alliance in this. Lucania et Bruttium, Etruria, Umbria, Picenum, Venetia et Istria, and Liguria. Significantly, the names of the Gallic populations, traditional enemies of Rome, are missing. Right? The Gauls had occupied most of northern Italy, also significant parts of the center. But here you have just the Regio Septima, the land of the boy, which is called Aemilia, so in memory of the main road axis of Romanization. We've seen it also in the videos about some medieval communes that rose from there, such as Parma, and the Regio Undecima, that had been the former land of the Insubres, and that was simply called Transpadana, that is to say, beyond the Po River. The military conquests of the late Republic and the ones in the early years of Augustus had, as we just said, expanded the boundaries of the empire. Yet, in order to dominate the world, it was also necessary to see it, right? The traditional Indo-European idea of power stemmed from vision, right? It's a bit like the eye of Ra. This is, again, more universal. So the sense is that just also in an age devoid of satellitary images, right, and also a very different sense of geography than today, just envisioning the boundaries of the empire was a huge deal, right? Rome was the center of the world, right? The urbs was placed at the heart of the orbis as such, and the roads to Italy and the provinces departed from Rome herself, so that all the roads lead to Rome. For this reason, Augustus had miliarum aureum, that is to say, the golden milestone, placed in the Roman Forum in 20 BC. Right, there was actually a column covered in gilded bronze on which the distances from Rome to the main cities of the empire are marked, right? And these measurements of the known world had already been undertaken probably on Caesar's initiative back in the day and had continued for several decades. This shows you how the Romans, in spite of their civil struggles, had already been envisaging the fact that by now they were definitely that hegemonic in the Mediterranean and Europe, that there was like the need of a true new golden age to connect, say, Rome with the entirety of these domains in a way that would be expanded further within the same through Romanization and through this new idea of augmentation in Golden Era. Augustus himself described the provinces and the extreme regions of the empire in his political autobiography that we will have, in fact, to make more than a video on, to say the least, the Res Gestae, Divi Augusti, later on, and numerous also historiographical and geographical works were published in his years. There was a greater, of course, interest in this just from also all those provinces that finally wanted this, this long period of instability over, right, in Rome, to maintain that degree of hegemony that by now was seen as the obvious consequence once, in fact, the Romans would stop to fight against one another. The creation destined to have the widest echo is undoubtedly the more famous map of the empire designed by Agrippa, to be displayed before everyone's eyes in the heart of Rome, affixed to the internal wall of the Porticus Vipsania. This was incredible, to say the least. It was essentially a large mural with the actual geographical representation of the empire, which was a novelty for the Romans. Of course, it had some broader insight from the Hellenistic world, thinking about Ptolemy, etc., in this, say, attempt to really create some geographical coordinates, whereas the Romans, as in the Miliarum Aureum, had maintained more the concept of the itinerarium. That is to say, how long, again, is it from the city to another, and so how long is it from Rome to any other place? And they would follow essentially a written path that told you literally, once you arrive here, just take this direction, and then it's yet another amount of miles, and then you'll meet this place, and so you went, right? The Agrippan map on the Porticus Vipsania was instead literally showing the surface of the Roman Empire, and also studied in precious stones for each and every one of the most important cities that Rome had conquered, right, as the biggest gem of all in the center of the world. So this large mural contributed to spreading the very idea of the universal empire that the Romans had finally achieved, and that Augustus in particular was essentially quite a great envisioner of, and by in fact visually representing the same. Even for the prestige, like the entertainment of the people, the display of the actual greatness of Rome, and in front of, in fact, all the peoples that would come to visit her, and that, say, maybe they knew, of course, where they were coming from within the same map, but they didn't have an idea of the extent of the Roman greatness. Augustus was naturally concerned to found moral basis for this gigantic dominion that could have not been held otherwise, right? And there were important challenges to face, right? One of the objectives of the Augustan regime was, first of all, to return to the ancient, primal, traditional morality of the Roman familias, right? Family as the fabric of society. After the civil wars, of course, entire populations had been destroyed, political ties had been severed because of the opposition, even within the same clans, of one member to the other. So it had been really a painful, bloody, and divisive situation. Plus, it had surely shattered what had been a moment of, say, Rome had undergone, say, aside from the major civil wars, a substantial time of instability, at least from the end of the 2nd century BC, with internal and external wars alike. But the latter conflicts had really changed society very much. It's as if, we'll look, I don't know, World War the First, World War the Second. They were not just devastating conflicts in terms of human losses, material destruction, but literally they had torn apart the fabric of society and really changed the times, changed the worldview, right? They had contributed in the aforementioned sin of splitting the Roman people, also in that increase of secularism and modernism. So that the family, the nucleus, the core basis had to be reinforced, right? Augustus issued that all men between 25 and 60 and women between 20 and 50 must marry, otherwise they could not receive inheritances or bequests or even participate in public ceremonies, right? In other words, family was a duty, right? Not a matter of choice. And I think this is, by the way, a quite important traditional insight. Divorces were discouraged, and a policy of demographic increase was pursued, by the way, because the civil wars had also taken out lots of people, and even if, again, that aforementioned Romano-Italic background had definitely been contributing massively to colonization, especially in the western half of the empire, it was important to replenish Italy further so that this manpower and moral force would have essentially been replenished and to expand, to consolidate the empire further. Right? There were incentives and privileges for those who had numerous children, while those who had no children could only receive half of what was intended for them in their will, which means that this wealth would go to the more prolific families that thus could, in that sense, pay also for a balanced upbringing of the new Romans, right, or to the state, right, so increasing overall. And so we're talking here, these were laws intended to especially make the bulk, the conservative majority of the Roman people keeping on with their, traditional, breeding, let's put it in this way. But it was also a way to regulate, especially the greater oligarchic patrimonies that were, through some, in fact, dynastic policies, trying to unite even more their own fortunes, so making some houses of Rome ever more powerful individually, but at the expense, in fact, of a broader base that could help dilute this this power through the multiple children generationally, and this was, of course, an attempt to part cash some of these people's wealth if they had not made enough children, and reinforcing the monarchy as such, right? Except, of course, this house had to prove to the others to be, equally prolific and orderly, and in fact, moral, right? And this is, in fact, one of the challenges, given that the Augustan house stemmed from the same background. Every extramarital relationship was persecuted, right? And definitely this is congruent with the conservative profile of the Roman-Italic peasantry. Again, at an oligarchic level, things were different. The moral example had to really be followed at every level. Needless to say, married women and virgins that were, of course, by law exclusively in these wars that are exclusively patriarchal throughout all Europe ever since the Indo-European migrations, under immense authority, right, and did not have a legal liberty in that regard. But also widows and, more independent women were, in this sense, to be regulated. So it was not just about childbearing, it was about a true code of behavior. So much so that the morality of women became a public fact, and immoral conduct a crime prosecuted by the state. These laws were naturally heavy, inasmuch as they were aimed at, of course, at regulating the behavior of, the entire Roman citizenry across this enormous base, with statal means that the Romans and, ancient states in general couldn't quite have. So it was in part just an inspiration, right? And Augustus felt compelled to offer the greatest example with his person and family, right? But in this case, it's that there were things that were not really going astray, as we've seen among his family, even his friends. Augustus had, and this was okay, for the reasons why this things had happened, but could point at the fact, at least, that these marriages had failed. 3 wives, as much as Agrippa, by the way. Julia, the aforementioned daughter of Augustus, and Scribonia had 3 husbands. Scribonia herself, before Augustus, had 2 husbands and a son from the second. Livia, as we've seen, had been taken away by Augustus from Tiberius Claudius Nero, Tiberius' father, while she was still married to him and pregnant with the latter. Repudiations, divorces were really normal actually among the nobility, and while of course the Roman elite was disciplined by Augustus to attain the standards of morality, of course the law of these pre-industrial societies was not so capillary, right? The Julian family could recur to repudiations and divorces, also because by law these were legitimized by certain circumstances. Yet it's obvious that there were private interests and reasons of state guiding marital choices as much as separations. The Julio-Claudians suffered, as you know, of a bad historiography from Flavian times towards them, because essentially the new clan had very different background and sort of role in there. So the private morality of the Julio-Claudian dynasty was always criticized at that point, and unfortunately most of what we know about them does stem from a later historiography that was also somehow critical of such such establishment that in a way they had to justify having supplanted later on. The fact, however, that the daughter and the granddaughter of Augustus were exiled for immoral conduct in Pandataria is a real thing. The exile in Thomas on the Black Sea of the famous poet Ovid seems connected exactly with a scandal that had occurred at the imperial court, and that is not entirely clear, but being apparently particularly serious. Agrippa Postumus, grandson of the emperor, as we have already seen, was removed from the succession and sent into exile because his behavior was scandalous, right? This guy was somehow crazy, violent, and definitely not representing the Apollonian order that his grandfather had so much tried to embody and to hope to see in his offspring. Tiberius, as we've seen, was forced by Augustus to repudiate his wife, his first one, whom he loved and who had already made him a father, which of course was even more painful for him. The prince's house behaved thus in not in open contrast, but definitely in an unorthodox way compared to the guiding principles of the Augustan regime. Furthermore, Augustus was accused, at least in this sort of historiographical chit-chat, of having had an unregulated sentimental life, right? Last this sense that he was involved also politically in all these issues. He wanted to also control his adversaries through their wives. So naturally, this is all sort of bad press or bad parchment, but papyrus of the time. Stories like he would have been provided by the same wife Livia with brides and virgins just for him. Naturally, it's difficult to look at these things in perspective because historically we do not have the certainty. We rely on few anecdotes on these things, and that's basically supposed to be history, even when, of course, there were specific reasons for telling this, aside from, say, what had actually happened. Also, we have to think what these people thought really of themselves as far as being the rulers of the world, and in fact that, of course, say the moral customs were different from today, in as much as, for example, mostly what the men could do as opposed to women, which was a very different story. So it's not much about thinking these were dissolute relations, but that, of course, there was a different phase of the world at the time, and Augustus, by, of course, asking for these, for, say, a moral straightening of the situation, would make the perfect sort of target of hypocrisy by by depicting him historiographically, for whichever reason, as the guy that would be against this very laws in practice. So there is no way to comment this in a more concrete way, if not by looking at what, of course, these clients saw just these relationships like, and especially at such high levels where political influences and connections were motivations could be quite much stronger than others. There are other, say, many historical instances of this sort of gossip, right, for the same political reasons that the historians could have. And we should, this is not, say, I don't make much of this history, but if you're interested, we could dwell in it some other video. In any case, surely this aforementioned figure, Colossus, in his own regard, especially from a military point of view, but not only because he was very versatile, etc., in many other fields, civilian ones, constructions, etc., infrastructures, stands out. We're talking about Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, whose name stands out still today, famously enough, on the architrave of the Pantheon. Interestingly enough, the gentilis, the noble name Vipsanius, is at least normally left out, right? Because Agrippa was the classic homo novus with relatively humble origins, and so he wanted, say, the Romans had this idea of stressing the simplicity of their background for showing how much the empire had been redemptional, and providing them with true merit, right, in the face of God, as opposed to being just already the advantaged one. We've seen this attitude even in that video about the reason why the Romans and the Etruscans never adopted any kind of hoplitic warfare at any time in their history, but why much later Roman historiography, exactly, by the way, of this time, in part, was so eager to say that, look, we were less, and then we overcame those who were more than us through their same tools, let's say, right? So this is also a type of morality that is not too known nowadays, where essentially those who have less constantly whine about that and do not actually do anything about it, also because they are some of the most disgustingly parasitic and spoiled individuals in the history of mankind, but of course they can't understand it because they're just envious about other people's accomplishments and essentially nothing else. Agrippa is definitely, again, a key figure, of course, of the Augustan regime. He was actually born just as Octavian, Gaius Octavius, in 63 BC. Right, they had the same age. This was, interestingly enough, the same year of Catiline's conspiracy, and I made a video about that, by the way. Agrippa would become the friend of the future Augustus since his youth, right? In Dyrrhachion, right? The two met each other, they became friends, and this relation would last their entire lives. Agrippa's political career, from the plebeian tribunate to the three consulates, was thus also linked to Octavian's fortunes. Right, the latter was, of course, the big shot of the situation, and Agrippa acted as his Armstrong, let's say. Agrippa distinguished himself as a general and an admiral, and we don't have time now to list all the various military accomplishments, but if you look at the civil wars, from the naval victories of Milazzo and Naulochus against Sextus Pompeius, I made a video, by the way, about that specifically, that clash between Augustus and Pompeius for Sicily. Agrippa on the occasion obtained the Corona Rostrata, which was essentially the decoration for naval accomplishments as a honor. There is also a coin here that shows you that. Agrippa commanded the fleet at Actium, right? What more can we say? But there are the campaigns of conquest of Germany in 39 BC, of Illyria between 35-34 and 13-12 BC. These were, major military operations. We will see them in many other videos. There were these other great figures, including Tiberius, the Augustus heirs. So Agrippa here was really the greatest trustee of Octavian. He was always faithful in that regard. So much so that together with Mycenas, Agrippa had represented Octavian in Rome until his return after Actium. In 23 BC, Agrippa was the custodian of the seal of Augustus on the occasion of a serious illness of the sovereign, which tells you there, again, the quite close, strong, and inoxidable relation between the two. This guy was literally holding the key to power there. Agrippa was repeatedly charged, in virtue of his abilities, with diplomatic and military missions in the east. For example, in 23 and 13 BC, in Gaul and in Spain between 20 and 18 BC. Those provinces had been somehow rebellious. He had to take care of the process of Romanization to go smoothly as it would go, as a matter of fact, also thanks to him. Agrippa also shared the censorship with Augustus in 28 BC, then the tribunician power from 18. This is yet another important point, together with the major proconsular power, which again put him as the same level as we've seen before of Augustus' heirs, fundamentally. Not only Agrippa was Augustus' closest collaborator, but on a formal and constitutional level, he was de facto the second man of the empire, right, for a long time. Throughout actually all his life, because he died consistently earlier than Augustus, as we've seen, and he actually had a quite of an ambition for himself. After two previous marriages with Pomponia Attica, from which Vipsania Agrippina, the wife of the future Emperor Tiberius, was born, and with Claudia Marcella, the daughter of Octavia, Augustus' sister, he finally married after lots of insistence and this other, and Augustus' daughter's previous marriages in 21 BC. In fact, the same Julia, the daughter of Augustus and Scribonia. that had in fact already been the widow of Marcus Claudius Marcellus, that was also, as we've seen, a son of Octavia. Agrippa had thus become Augustus' son-in-law, finally, right? And in fact, his blood would consistently live on. We've seen it actually in the video about Caligula, for example. We'll come back to this, and of course here I inserted somewhere a genealogical tree of the Julio-Claudians. It's pretty intricated, right? But at least if you have some familiarity with the house, you can understand all these various connections even without it. So from Agrippa and Julia's marriage, as we've seen, Gaius and Lucius, the two Caesars adopted by Augustus as successors, were born together with Julia and Agrippina, the latter being later on the wife of Germanicus, right? And Agrippa Postumus, finally. So you understand how life goes on, right? One of Agrippa's tasks, main tasks by the way, was the water supply of the thirsty city of Rome, right? The city was becoming really big, and in many ways this growth had been unregulated because, say, doesn't matter how advanced the Romans were, we are still looking at, again, times in which most of this growth were spontaneous. There was no initial planning, and this Augustan time, of course, was a moment of great settlement of many issues that also the urbs had, right? And that's where Agrippa also, aside from being a brilliant commander, stood out, above all for urban building initiatives in the eastern part of the Campus Martius, this area that had historically been, again, deputed to the training of the Roman army. It was closer to a marshy area along the Tiber in the north part of the center. And it had been, of course, claimed, somehow already built on. But Agrippa completed the porticos of the enclosures for the comitia councils that had been begun by Caesar and continued by Lepidus, the Saepta Julia. Agrippa adorned them with statues and works of art, adding a building for the counting of votes, the Diribitorium. All right. Between 27 and 25 BC, he built the first Pantheon, which is not technically the one you see, in fact, but still, right, immediately afterwards, in the same area, he built the oldest public buildings in Rome. Next to them, surrounded by gardens and sports facilities, he had an artificial lake. This was really masterpieces of engineering, of hydraulics, the Stagnum Agrippae, right? The Agrippan pond, fundamentally, that was dug, and the waters of which flowed into the Tiber via the Euripus Canal. In the center stood Agrippa's own villa. This entire complex designed for rest and leisure after, a lifetime of massive military accomplishment, was powered by the new Aqua Virgo aqueduct, right? So the virgin spring, right, virgin water, which at the time crossed the Tiber on the Agrippae pond, so Agrippa's bridge, corresponding today in the modern city of Rome to Sixtus Bridge, right, Ponte Sisto. And to the east of this area, near a public park known as the Campus Agrippae, right, so Agrippa's Field, stood the aforementioned Porticus Vipsania that was built actually after Agrippa's death by his sister and Augustus as a tribute to the man and relative. Furthermore, to guarantee the supply and prompt distribution of cereals, Agrippa had also created the Horea Agrippiana, so this monumental market slash granary slash warehouse on the southeastern slopes of the Palatine, so to also reinforce the grain supplies to feed the Roman mob. By the way, again, was also another need: water, food, and general stability, right? And drainage of swamps. That Augustus will look at his say monuments, and because you know what was said about him, that he had found a city of mutton and he left it as one of marble. But it's not today's case, right? Just it's important to remember that having Agrippa died in 12 BC, he was paid exceptional funeral honors, and Augustus himself delivered the eulogy for the man that would be buried in his own mausoleum, that, as we will see now, Augustus had already built 40 years before his death, which is something you may want to do yourself. If you, I have a family tomb, but that's a huge privilege, and it's not here technically, but whatever. So there is a song, right? The lyrics of a song: faith, peace, honor, and ancient modesty, lost virtue now dare to return, and abundance appears happy with its full horn. Right? These verses were sung by choirs of girls and boys in front of the aforementioned temple of Apollo Palatine, as we've seen connected with Augustus' palace, singing. In fact, this poem composed by Horace for the secular games of 17 BC. As you understand from the text here, Horace had been celebrating the return of the mythical Golden Age, long dreamed of, prophesied, and brought by the new princeps Augustus. The anticipation was immense. Heralds in ancient costumes announced, quote, a celebration such as no one has seen and no one will see again. Right? The direction of the celebration is Augustus and Agrippa, who for that fateful year had themselves elected magistrates by the college that supervised the sacred ceremonies, those priestly functions carried out by, the Queen de Camveri Sacris Facundis. So literally this 15 men that make the sacred, right? We will talk more about them, but it's obvious that in these great festivals, also this various colleges, etc., were very political and symbolic and loaded with in this case, an institutional role, because the city of Rome was purified. And according to an archaic ritual, the people participated in the ceremony. Right? It was really a matter of, contributing collectively to the sole imperial objective through nocturnal offerings of first fruits on the Aventine, which was a bit, as you know, like the popular hill of Rome. And in these nocturnal ceremonies, the goddesses of destiny, the protector goddesses of women in labor, and Mother Earth, goddess of fertility, were invoked. This is really normal for the plebeians that, as you know, maintain, generally speaking, a chthonic cult, right? Just like today, right? The poorer people tend to be more sort of materialistic, to say the least, at least in this sort of more populistic, deterministic, more feminine, telluric-based sense of the earth, right? In this case, however, everything, as we were saying before, was recognized as fully integrated hierarchically within the now re-established cosmic order, in which, of course, the Mother Earth had to, of course, respond to the to the women that were to being gravitated by the race of world rulers that had deserved them, and so, but that had to, in fact, have tamed the same deities of the underworld in order to achieve, of course, the new life, the new birth. So in the following 3 days, Augustus and Agrippa offered themselves as sacrifices to oxen, to Jupiter Capitolinus, while to Juno Regina, 2 cows. Finally, cakes were literally given to Apollo and Diana. Right, so here you have the aforementioned complementarity of the virile Apollonian heavenly order and the feminine chthonic telluric one, right? 110 mothers invoked Juno's protection over the state and the family, because they were the ones, as we've seen also with Livia's example, to keep that responsibility as far as their female dimension was concerned. And the people, fascinated by the grandeur and charm of such ceremonies, might have well believed that nothing was greater than Rome, whose greatness and prosperity were based on the value of arms, on the fidelity to traditions, on the morality of the family. And no one is greater than the Princeps, the refounder of Rome, the restorer of the Golden Age, and of Rome's dominance over the entire universe. This aspect is fascinating because, of course, Augustus' foundations would last for centuries, just intact in the institutional forms, and even more as far as the Roman imperial legacy would go on to this very day. If anything, as a model, right, in the titles, in the names, in the symbols, all over the world. So, as we were saying before, there was a contrast between this always and, say, reality to some degree, because of the world that somehow still changes, right? What Rome was able to achieve through Augustus and the same providential, evangelic, and eschatological ideology, right, of the replication of these eras. You've heard before that this golden era, like just by tradition, was to come just after the Bronze Age, and so eventually give way to the Iron one that here had just started. But you can also think it was a sort of hybrid for the world to be going towards the twilight of the gods again, right? So it was a foundational moment from which, however, the world till this day has done nothing but degenerating in that awareness of the sacred in the heart of man. the crisis of collective values had, as we've seen, characterized the last decades of the dying republic, reason for which the end of the civil wars stemming from it was celebrated by, again, the Augustan era. And you have an interesting funerary monument representing a bit the, let's say, level of sensualistic, contemplative taste for self-representation in wealth, right? We've seen how Augustus wouldn't obstinate to match luxus in his house. I made a video, by the way, about the contrast between the mores and the luxus as far as the 2nd century BC Rome was concerned, and how harsh the debate was in Roman society regarding to these issues, because they didn't really care that much. But the lower people, of course, would buy more in the extravagant forms in order to assert themselves and, showing off, right? Especially the new rich, right? Those who had managed, from their perspective, of course, even to win by some, legitimate degree, greater power and wealth, but that evidently, as the new riches lacked a bit the moralia required in order to handle this achievement in the first place. We're talking about the monument of the baker Euryzacus, right? He was a freedman who enriched himself by supplying bread to the Roman state, right? He had purchased land, as at that point would have been typical for somebody who could afford it, in a very popular area, by the way, immediately outside what is today's Porta Maggiore, between Via Labicana and Via Praenestina, and had a building that built around, in fact, 30 BC, this singular funerary monument that can still be, in fact, seen quite in full display in the same location, of course. And this tomb fundamentally shows all the stages of bread making. Even the urn with the ashes of Euryzacus' wife, Atistia, was shaped, for example, like a cupboard, right? Quite different, however, in nature, and on the Appian Way stands on a rise in the ground the imposing tomb of Caecilia Metella. This also dates roughly to the 30 BC, which in fact is also a very famous monument in Rome, a cylindrical tower resting on a square base and covered by a mound that now is disappeared, and which was essentially, in this case, an imitation of the archaic burials of the Roman aristocratic families, right? The woman was the daughter of a consul from an ancient, in fact, aristocratic clan, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Creticus, wife of the son of Gaius Licinius Crassus, as you know, one of the richest men in Rome. And this tomb was so, say, majestic that it was eventually fortified during the Middle Ages, as many Roman monuments, right, essentially as a castle along the Appian Way, so quite strategically in nature, and in fact the place of some interesting ambushes along the path, etc. Naturally, there were lots of these buildings, right? We see now just what remains of the same, etc. But imagine, right, at the time, what Rome could be in practice without spoliations, etc. So this desire to even to show wealth, right, to demonstrate, like, also the importance of the individual, the participation into the divine glory, but obstinating wealth after all, is quite there. this taste for the exotic at the same time also characterizes, for example, the pyramid-shaped sepulchral monument erected in the Ostiense Gate, right, another very popular place by Gaius Castius, dating to 12 BC. This was one of the last spectacular monuments of the Roman aristocracy, by the way, so these were sort of extravagances, but hey, the Egyptians did, why not copy this? After all, the Romans had been bringing obelisks and sort of cumulating this greater power from the faraway lands, and the pyramids, as you know, had some much more than just monumental function. They really meant like to claim a status and in a meaning, in a sort of worldview that aligned with also God knows how much lost knowledge that they had about that at the time. The Romans were quite rough, and they had a sort of more morally based, primitive view, and also these other Hellenistic Oriental countries. But right, they still were receptive now, and they felt legitimately as the rulers of the world in order to draw from wherever, whatever they wanted. Starting from the Augustan age, the typology of family tomb, however, becomes more modest, right? This is surely a consequence of the same Augustan moral impact on Rome, right? The monument becomes a simple altar, right? And this gets down to the very origins of Roman Italic tradition. Everything has to reflect that primal simplicity and moral devotion that had characterized the Roman expansion. Urns and portraits were placed in niches created in the walls of the building, which took on the appearance of a columbarium. This solution was chosen by the families of the higher aristocracy, but also by the freedmen, especially the imperial ones, and by the members of professional associations, as we've seen with Euryzacus, this guild that had really a substantial power in Rome. But of course, they were in the latter case just, of course, a substantial step under the aristocracy, to say the least. Monumental tombs as such became rare, right? They seemed too excessive, too flamboyant, too, say, modest, right, for Roman virtue, and were sought after, in fact, only by the new riches, right? They were eager to have a showy burial from which their wealth without nobility would shine through, and that, of course, was a sin. And of course, the Romans complained about this because they saw it as, that's not what we are about fundamentally, and you're not great if you do that, on the contrary. So upon the death of Augustus, the Vestal virgins delivered his will, deposited with them, together with 3 scrolls with the detailed provisions for the funeral, right? The interesting aspect of this is that the Vestal virgins were the ones that would keep, as you know, the sacred fire, right? Indo-European tradition had, at least especially in the Vedic one, associated mostly a virile dimension to these fire keepers, but at least in Rome, this function had been deputed to this, in fact, still virgin, and so still Apollonian element in Roman religion. The funeral, as you know, we'll talk about the Roman imperial funeral. As you know, there was a very and deeply important show, especially with the decursio, with the sense of course, the imperial soul ascending to heaven, and all the military decorations of the knights deputed, as we often see, to that being that sort of more let's say, unbecoming sort of heroes that had to achieve the greatest exploit were rendered back to the funeral pyre while burning, and an eagle was left free, right, to rise to heaven together with the emperor. The vassals had received by Augustus for his death the summary report on the organization of defense and the financial situation of the Roman state, which is also again quite meaningful in their hands, the list of Augustus' undertakings to engrave on bronze tablets to be placed in front of his mausoleum, that, as we've seen, had been built more than 20 years before in the Campus Martius, where of course you can still see it in say decent conditions considering the time past. These tables have been lost, unfortunately, but the text of the Res Gestae Divi Augusti at that point, given that of course Augustus was deified, had been engraved on the walls of numerous temples of Augustus in different parts of the empire and even beyond, right? You know, there was a temple Augustus in Malabar, India, right? So the prestige of the sovereign and of the empire was of course going far beyond the let's say any concept of border that we have today, and such deeds were felt again in a very metaphysical way. I will make a video explaining the truly felt evangelical sense of world transfiguration by Augustus, and how also deeply this affected Christianity, given that, by the way, Christ was born exactly under Augustus' reign, and there is, as you know, a lot to discuss. The Hellenic and Latin versions of the Res Gestae were engraved on the wall of the Augusteum of the ancient Ankara, that is today's Ankara in Turkey. In fact, are known as the Monumentum Ancyranum in Latin. And this is our greatest fortune in this matter, because we can, of course, read what the great epigraphist and historian Theodor Mommsen would not hesitate to call as, quote, the queen of inscriptions, right, in the history of mankind, right, in a way that goes far beyond. And again, that's why we absolutely must make a video about the Res Gestae, because it's, together with the Arapakis, one of the single most important events in the entire history of mankind by far, right? Just for the fact of having been established in the first place. So the text reflects exactly that Roman primitive but effective simplicity, right? It's extremely concise, sometimes telegraphic, you could say, and it reports in order the following: the list of honors conferred on Augustus by the Senate and the Roman people for his merits, the donations made by Augustus to the res publica, to the soldiers, to the plebs, and the list of games and shows offered at his expense. The account of Augustus' exploit in peace and war, and in the Res Gestae, which naturally had even more than an official character, sort of metaphysical one, there is no mention, interestingly enough, of Augustus' private life or his family, right, for reasons that we will see at some other time. You have, though, the names of Agrippa, Tiberius, Gaius, and Lucius occurring insofar as they are linked to public facts or public honors, right? And this is what mattered for the imperium that was the word one, right? So also the monarchic sense here is shown true, because these were the individuals that in any case had been the most important in Augustus' reign, and thus they just are mentioned together with him. So it was enough to do that. There was no need to categorize, to conceptualize his family as such. Today, the cultured tourist can read the Res Gestae on the side wall of the Ara Pacis in front of the Augusto. And it is the really one of the most beautiful things you can do, just if you know the text, if you have read it, to understand the very theology of Augustus in this, the concept of the divine auspices, the fact it was essentially the medium, and that his rule, his earthly rule, stemmed exactly from, as we've seen, a god, and that is God just per se. Consider that in Latin there are no articles, so it's all beyond words. And again, today we can talk about that because the video is already fairly long by itself, but this is just for giving you an idea of the magnitude of the accomplishment that, of course, the empire had been at that point, and how the Romans were finding through Augustus a much deeper sense of themselves and of their accomplishment for essentially us, right, to come, because this was thought really to be a watershed in the history of mankind, and objectively it's difficult to see how any other has been ever even established compared to this. And we'll get more, of course, into it as far as also the videos on traditional religion are concerned, because as we've seen from the Sol Invictus, Augustus had matched this. The entire triumphal procession of the Roman emperors was about this, right, with the red face of the sun, of the rendering to God like the spoils of war, in self-sacrifice in all the combat, and the temporary elevation of this human to a divine condition, and eventually, and at least theoretically, having to render the soul to God, with winning a space in the firmament, right? And deification was a big deal, because the entire Roman monarchy at this point was founded on this sense of leadership, right? It had never really ceased to exist, right? The fact that, again, now I can't digress on it, but the fact that Rome had once been a monarchy, and that power had been split, because essentially monarchs were not seen as individually fit to rule as they should have, didn't mean that in the sense Rome was, that the purpose of tradition is not to make this coming back, right, to that point. This is exactly, at least in the scale of achievement, that, of course, the Augustan establishment represents, also for the nature of the empire later on, and aside from the fact that gradual decline of also the fitness of any other ruler earthly ever since, of course, was exactly that inversion of trend of the earth degeneration, and the reaffirmation of a golden era between the third and the last one, so between the Bronze and the Iron Age one, and this is again one of those things you may not want to miss when you think about Roman history and how much these peoples were connected with a dimension that we do not quite understand anymore at any level, right? Politically, socially, culturally, etc. And that, however, I think studying history does help to recover exactly in this sense. In any case, again, that's why I make all these various videos. There is an Augustan history playlist if you're interested, so that's where you can find all the stuff, and a Roman history one for all other topics. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.